We were supposed to go on at 9 o'clock at night. Didn't go on till 6 o'clock in the morning. Stayed on stage all night, no bathroom. And taking lots of drugs. I was surprised we were able to perform at all.
She stood on a stage in Germany, too drunk to remember the words, while an entire crowd burned the equipment behind her out of pure rage. That night nearly ended her career. Instead, it became the opening chapter of one of the strangest comeback stories in rock history. Grace Slick went from psychedelic icon to platinum pop star to a woman who walked away at the top and never looked back. Behind the shiny radio hits of chart records she never wanted to break, and a decision that shocked an entire industry. Now, at 85, Grace Slick is finally revealing what really happened behind the carefully crafted image of her and Starship. Because the story the public celebrated was never the story she was actually living. When everything fell apart. By the mid-1970s, key members of Jefferson Airplane had scattered into side projects of their own. Two of the band's most important musicians left to focus on a separate group entirely, pulling apart the lineup that had built the original sound everyone knew. Slick and her longtime collaborator Paul Kantner rebuilt what remained into a new group called Jefferson Starship. For a while, the reinvention actually worked. The new band scored hit albums and packed arenas, and Slick remained the face most fans associated with the sound. But underneath the surface success, a much darker problem was quietly taking over her life, one that had been building for years without most fans ever noticing. Slick had struggled with alcohol for a long time, and by 1978, it had become impossible to hide from anyone around her. Earlier that same year, she caused chaos at a local comedy show taping in San Francisco, arguing with fellow judges and getting physically removed from the stage after breaking equipment in front of a jeering crowd. Later that same day, she was arrested for drunk driving and spent the night in custody, a detail that barely made headlines compared to what happened next. The real breaking point came a few months later, on tour in Germany. The band was set to headline a major outdoor festival, but Slick was too intoxicated to perform, forcing organizers to cancel the show outright. Furious at losing the concert entirely, the crowd rioted and set fire to the band's own equipment on stage, turning what should have been one night of music into a genuine disaster. Kantner had seen enough. He asked Slick to leave the band, and she did, stepping away from the group she had helped build for the sake of everyone's safety and sanity, including her own. For the next few years, she worked outside Jefferson Starship, releasing solo albums while quietly trying to get sober, one of which earned a Grammy nomination for how personal and raw it felt compared to anything she had written before. One of the solo albums she released during this stretch, titled Dreams, drew heavily on what she had learned attending recovery meetings while working through her sobriety, and critics at the time noted how much more personal and vulnerable the songwriting felt compared to anything from her earlier catalog. It remains one of the most emotionally direct records of her entire career, even though far fewer people heard it compared to her work with the band. It took real time and real effort, but by the early 1980s, Slick had cleaned herself up enough to return, first as an occasional guest on the band's records, and then as a full member once again. The band she came back to, however, was already drifting toward a sound none of the original members would fully recognize a few years later. By 1984, Jefferson Starship was pulling hard toward a polished, radio-friendly pop sound that felt worlds away from the psychedelic experimentation that had made Jefferson Airplane one of the defining bands of the 1960s. The shift brought commercial opportunities, but it also created deep divisions inside the group. No one felt that conflict more strongly than Paul Kantner. As the last remaining founding member of Jefferson Airplane still performing with the band, he believed the music had drifted too far from the ideals that had inspired its creation nearly 20 years earlier. The emphasis on radio-ready production, outside songwriters, and mainstream appeal stood in sharp contrast to the creative freedom that had once defined the band. In June of that year, Kantner finally reached his limit. He left the group for good, ending a creative partnership with Grace Slick that had shaped almost 2 decades of music from the height of the San Francisco counterculture to the polished arena rock world of the 80s. Kantner did not leave quietly. Only months after his departure, he filed a lawsuit against his former bandmates, arguing that he had helped build the reputation attached to the Jefferson name and that the remaining members had no right to continue using it without his involvement. What had begun as a disagreement over musical direction quickly became a legal battle over ownership, identity, and legacy. The dispute dragged on for months, consuming time and energy from a band that was already struggling to redefine itself without its most influential founding member. In March of 1985, both sides finally reached an agreement outside of court. The settlement permanently changed the future of the group. Neither side could use the words Jefferson or Airplane again unless every surviving original member of Jefferson Airplane agreed to it together. An arrangement that was practically impossible given how divided everyone had become over the years. With no realistic way to keep performing under the existing name, the remaining musicians had little choice but to abandon part of their identity altogether. Just like that, after nearly 2 decades of shared history, Jefferson Starship officially became simply Starship. The change involved far more than removing a single word from a concert poster. It represented the symbolic end of one musical era and the beginning of another. Grace Slick suddenly found herself as the only person left in the touring lineup who had ever stood on stage with the original Jefferson Airplane. In many ways, she had become the final living bridge between the band's revolutionary past and its increasingly commercial present, carrying memories of the counterculture into a group that now looked and sounded completely different. The legal settlement failed to bring stability. Instead, the internal changes accelerated. During recording sessions for the next album, one longtime member who had remained loyal through the lawsuit grew increasingly frustrated after watching an outside keyboardist perform much of the instrumental work that band members had traditionally handled themselves. Feeling that the group's identity was slipping away piece by piece, he eventually chose to leave as well, reducing the number of longtime musicians even further and leaving Slick surrounded by an almost entirely new generation of performers. How Grace Slick became a legend. Long before she became one of the most recognizable voices in rock music, Grace Slick grew up in a very different world. She was born in 1939 near Chicago, the daughter of an investment banker father and a mother who had once worked as a singer herself. The family eventually settled in Palo Alto, California, a world away from the chaos that later helped define her. She attended an all-girls private high school before spending short stretches at 2 different colleges, first in New York and then in Florida. Nothing about that path suggested a future in rock music. By her own account, she picked her college mainly because it happened to be located in New York City, not because of any real academic plan. Everything changed after she watched a scrappy new San Francisco band called Jefferson Airplane play a small club. Inspired by what she saw, she formed her own group first, a band called The Great Society, with her then-husband on drums and her brother-in-law on guitar. It did not last long, but it gave her a taste of performing that she never lost. In 1966, the lead singer of Jefferson Airplane left the band to raise her child, and the remaining members asked Slick to step in. She brought 2 songs with her from her old band, and within a year, both had become massive hits on a landmark album released in 1967. Almost overnight, Slick became one of the most recognizable voices of an entire generation. One of those 2 songs drew directly from a children's book about a girl who falls through a rabbit hole into a strange, rule-breaking world, reimagined by Slick as a commentary on experimentation and questioning authority. The other became an anthem about searching for genuine connection in a chaotic world, and both songs climbed into the top 10 on the national singles chart within months of release. By the end of the decade, she had performed at both the Monterey Pop Festival and Woodstock, appearing in front of hundreds of thousands of people at the height of the counterculture movement. Her image, her voice, and her fearless attitude made her a defining figure of San Francisco rock. But the band that made her famous would not stay in that original form forever. And what came next would test her in ways stardom never had. Behind the music, Slick was also living through a complicated personal life that would shape the band for years to come. She had married a cinematographer in 1961, and that marriage lasted a decade before ending in 1971, the same year everything else in her life shifted dramatically. Around that time, Slick became involved with her Jefferson Airplane bandmate Paul Kantner, the same man who would later co-found Jefferson Starship alongside her. Their relationship lasted several years, and in January of 1971, the couple welcomed a daughter together, a child who would later go on to pursue her own career in acting and music. The two never married, but they continued working side by side for years after their romantic relationship ended, co-writing songs and running an entire band together while also raising a child between two very public lives. It was an unusual arrangement, even by the standards of 1970s rock and roll, and it added an extra layer of complexity to every creative decision the band made afterward. That same period nearly ended in tragedy before it ever produced a hit record. In 1971, Slick was seriously injured in a car accident while racing another Jefferson Airplane member on the open road, an incident that sidelined the band for a stretch and forced everyone involved to slow down, at least temporarily. Despite the chaos in her personal life, Slick kept working. She contributed to an early science fiction concept album with Kantner, considered one of the first of its kind in rock music, and released her own solo material under a nickname given to her by a fellow musician friend who called her the Chrome Nun as a nod to her cool, detached stage persona. None of that early creative momentum could fully prepare the band for what alcohol was about to do to their stability. The band they never planned to become. None of the Starship's success would have been possible without a singer. Most casual fans never fully connect to the earlier psychedelic years. Mickey Thomas joined the band in the late 1970s, brought in specifically for his powerful, radio-friendly voice at a moment when the group needed a sound built for mainstream stations. Thomas quickly became the other lead voice fans associated with the band, sharing vocal duties with Slick on the biggest singles of the entire decade. Their voices together, one rooted in 60s counterculture and one built for 80s arena rock, became the actual sonic signature people now remember whenever that era of the band comes up. The second single from Knee Deep in the Hoopla, a softer romantic ballad called Sarah, also reached #1 on the charts within weeks of release, giving the band back-to-back chart toppers from a single album. It was an almost unheard-of achievement for a group that had been tied up in a bitter lawsuit only months earlier. The pairing worked commercially in every measurable way, but it also symbolized exactly what longtime fans found so unsettling about the new direction. Where the old band once built songs around improvisation and shared creative input from every member, this new version increasingly relied on outside writers pairing two distinct voices together for maximum radio impact, a formula more common in manufactured pop groups than in a band with roots stretching back to 1965. Slick has said in later interviews that working alongside Thomas was never the source of any personal tension. The tension, in her telling, was always about the material itself and the process behind it, not about any single bandmate standing next to her under the stage lights. Thomas had actually joined the band back in 1979, brought in specifically to fill the gap left behind after both Slick and another founding vocalist stepped away from the group during its earlier turmoil. He spent years performing duets with Slick once she returned, and he became the more consistent commercial presence overall, staying through nearly every lineup change for decades afterward, long after every other familiar face from the 60s and 70s had already moved on to other things. The newly renamed Starship released an album called Knee Deep in the Hoopla in 1985, and it went platinum almost immediately after release. Two singles from that album shot straight to #1 on the American charts, an outcome nobody in the band could have confidently guaranteed given how much turmoil had led up to its release just months earlier. One of those singles became the song most people now associate with the entire Starship era. Unlike the material Slick had written herself decades earlier, this track was built almost entirely by outside songwriters and producers, engineered from the ground up to dominate mainstream radio playlists rather than reflect any real personal experience of the people actually singing it. The strategy worked exactly as designed, and the song became inescapable across American radio for months on end. For a woman who had once written lyrics inspired by a children's book about falling down a rabbit hole, and who had once used her music to comment on social upheaval sweeping the entire country, singing corporate-friendly pop was a jarring shift in identity. In interviews given years later, she described feeling almost no personal connection to material written this way, calling the entire approach far removed from anything she would have chosen to create on her own terms as an artist. Commercially, none of that internal conflict seemed to matter to anyone outside the band. Starship kept climbing the charts, and the record label kept pushing for more of the exact same formula that had worked so well the first time around. The tension between what actually sold records and what felt honest to the people singing them was only just getting started, and it would only grow sharper as the decade wore on toward its end. 2 years later, that quiet tension would collide head-on with something nobody in the band fully expected, a chart record that made headlines for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the music itself. The biggest hit of her life, and the last. In 1987, Starship released another song that also shot straight to #1 on the charts. This time, the achievement came attached to an unusual footnote that surprised even longtime industry insiders who thought they had seen every kind of chart milestone already possible. At 47 years old, Slick became the oldest female vocalist in history to sing lead on a #1 hit on the American Billboard chart. It was a record that stood completely untouched for over a decade, before another famous singer finally broke it years later, well into her own 50s. The song appeared that same year in a major Hollywood film about a fashion designer whose window display comes to life. A light-hearted romantic comedy that became a modest box office hit, largely thanks to the song's constant radio presence. The track went on to earn an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Song, an honor few pop songs from that era ever managed to receive. On paper, an achievement like this should have felt like an obvious career high point for anyone working in the music business at the time. For Slick, it mostly seemed to highlight something else entirely about her situation within the band. She was now more than 2 decades older than most of her bandmates, performing music written specifically for a much younger pop audience, inside an industry that rarely made room for aging rock musicians, and even more rarely made room for aging women in particular. The album housing this hit single, released under the title No Protection, went gold and kept Starship firmly planted in the mainstream spotlight throughout that entire year. But behind the platinum plaques and glowing headlines, the actual lineup of the band was quietly falling apart piece by piece, and Slick was already inching toward a decision that would end her time with the group completely. By early 1988, almost every familiar face from the original lineup was gone. Kantner had left years earlier during the lawsuit. Other longtime members, including the bassist who had helped shape the band's earlier sound throughout the 70s, had exited one by one, each replaced by younger session musicians brought in specifically to fit the new commercial direction of the group. Slick found herself as the only person left in the entire lineup who remembered the earlier decades of the band at all, stretching back to the psychedelic clubs of San Francisco in the 1960s. Every other member on stage with her now was more than 10 years younger, and the gap between them was never really about age alone. It was about what the music itself was supposed to represent, and who it was actually written for in the first place. In February of 1988, Slick left Starship for good, walking away from a band still riding high commercially rather than waiting for the momentum to fade on its own terms. She was later quoted describing her reasoning bluntly, suggesting that older performers simply did not belong on a rock and roll stage built primarily for a younger generation. A belief she would repeat consistently for years afterward in nearly every interview on the subject. It was a striking position to hear from someone who had spent her entire adult life as a professional performer in front of massive crowds around the world. Rather than clinging to the fame and financial security the band still offered her, she chose to step away from all of it entirely, and to do so on her own terms rather than waiting to be pushed out again the way she nearly had been a decade earlier in Germany. That decision did not mark the complete end of her music career just yet, but it came remarkably close. Financially, she had little reason to worry about the choice. Unlike many musicians of her era, Slick had kept ownership of her own publishing rights over the years, meaning royalties from her earliest hits continued paying out regardless of whether she ever performed again. A safety net that made walking away far less risky than it might have looked from the outside. What followed was one final reunion with the people who had started it all alongside her, and then a retirement that would completely reshape the rest of her life going forward. What happened after she left? Slick's exit did not calm the chaos inside Starship. If anything, the years right after she left turned out to be some of the most turbulent in the entire history of the group, proving that the tension she had described was never really about her alone. With Slick gone, Mickey Thomas became the sole lead singer, and the band brought in an almost entirely new lineup to record their next album, released in the summer of 1989. A single from that record climbed into the top 20, and another track was even featured in a popular film, keeping the Starship name alive commercially, even without any of its original members left standing. But the peace did not last long. In September of that same year, while the band was on tour in Pennsylvania, a violent backstage altercation broke out between the drummer and Thomas himself. A fight serious enough to make headlines and further destabilize an already fragile lineup built almost entirely from replacement musicians. By the early 1990s, the group briefly went on hiatus before reforming under a slightly adjusted name, rebranding itself as Starship featuring Mickey Thomas to make clear that almost nothing remained of the original band that had once included Slick, Kantner, and the rest of the founding Jefferson Airplane lineup. Meanwhile, a completely separate version of the group, led by Kantner himself, and eventually featuring different singers entirely, continued touring for years under the restored Jefferson Starship name, occasionally welcoming Slick back for the rare guest appearance. The split between the two camps was not always friendly on paper. In the years after her departure, Slick took legal action against Thomas and the band on more than one occasion over how the Starship name and catalog were being used commercially. Thomas has said publicly since then that he holds no ill will toward her at all, describing their actual relationship away from the courtroom as warm, even as their two versions of the same band legacy kept colliding in business disputes for years afterward. Two bands, two names, and two very different legacies had grown out of a single lawsuit settlement from 1985, a split that fans still find confusing decades later whenever they try to sort out which lineup made which song. In 1989, Slick reunited with her original Jefferson Airplane bandmates for a self-titled reunion album and a short accompanying tour. It gave longtime fans one final chance to see something close to the classic lineup performing together, more than 2 decades after their original 60s heyday had defined an entire counterculture movement across the country. By 1990, Slick had retired from music almost entirely, stepping fully away from touring and recording for the first time in her entire adult life. In interviews given afterward, she explained her reasoning in blunt terms, arguing that rock and roll was fundamentally built for expressing a young person's anger and restless energy, and that continuing to perform decades-old songs past a certain age felt hollow and dishonest to her personally as an artist. Retirement did not mean disappearing from public life completely, however. In 1995, she briefly joined a reunited version of Jefferson Starship for a one-off show at a well-known venue in Los Angeles later released as a live recording for fans who could not attend the event in person. In late 2001, she agreed to appear once more for a single performance shortly after the September 11th attacks shook the entire country. That particular appearance became famous in its own right, entirely separate from the music itself. Slick walked out on stage covered head to toe in a black garment resembling a burqa, then dramatically removed it to reveal a shirt underneath bearing an American flag, alongside a blunt, defiant message about standing up to fear. She later explained the statement was aimed at oppression in general, rather than at any single religion or culture, a distinction she felt strongly about clarifying afterward in interviews. Outside of these rare and carefully chosen appearances, Slick turned almost entirely toward painting for the remainder of her career. She had loved visual art since early childhood, long before music ever entered the picture, and after her performing career ended, she built an entirely second career, creating portraits of fellow musicians from her era, including several who had already passed away by the time she painted them. In 1996, she was formally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a member of Jefferson Airplane, cementing the legacy of the earlier era she has always described feeling closest to emotionally. In 1998, Slick published a full autobiography detailing her decades in music, walking readers through the highs of the 60s and the messier years that followed with unusual honesty for a rock memoir. The book gave fans their clearest look yet at how she personally viewed the difference between the counterculture era that made her famous and the polished pop years that made her rich. Meanwhile, the Jefferson Starship name that had once triggered an entire lawsuit continued touring well into the 2000s under Kantner and a rotating cast of musicians, eventually adding a new female lead singer to handle the vocal parts Slick had originated decades earlier. That version of the band, filled almost entirely with musicians born long after the 60s counterculture movement had ended, still plays some of the same songs Slick once sang on the exact same stages, carrying pieces of her voice forward even though she herself stepped away from performing for good. Years after leaving the band, Grace Slick made a decision that surprised many longtime fans. She agreed to license the very song she had once admitted she never felt deeply connected to for use in a national fast food commercial. On the surface, the choice seemed to contradict everything she had said over the years about her discomfort with Starship's polished pop era. But there was more to the story. Rather than keeping the money for herself, Slick donated the entire licensing payment to a legal organization supporting LGBTQ civil rights, explaining that she strongly disagreed with the political stance of the company using her music. It was a quiet but powerful gesture that reflected the same independent spirit and personal convictions she had carried throughout her career. Today, at 86 years old, Grace Slick rarely discusses her years with Starship publicly without a noticeable note of distance creeping into her voice. She does not regret the choices that led her there, and she has never pretended the platinum records and chart milestones did not matter to her career or her finances along the way. But the woman who once wrote about a rabbit hole and a looking glass never fully recognized herself in the polished, radio-ready sound that ultimately made her more commercially famous than ever before in her long career. And even now, decades later, she has never once pretended otherwise to anyone. Grace Slick's career was anything but ordinary. She helped define the sound of the 60s, reinvented herself in the 80s, survived personal struggles, broke records, and then walked away on her own terms while still at the top. Few artists have changed with the times as successfully or been as honest about the cost of that success. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us which music legend you'd like to see featured next.